legalisefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host, Greg Moffat. Exactly 13 years since his first appearance, Anthony Peake returns to Legalise Freedom to discuss his latest book, Near-Death Experiences, the Science, Psychology and Anthropology Behind the Phenomenon. Refusing to pander to the false dichotomy between militant materialists and woo-woo peddlers, Peake simultaneously seeks scientific explanations for extraordinary human experiences, whilst acknowledging that the materialist-reductionist worldview will never have all the answers. His work ploughs a path which has become increasingly important as acceptance of myriad other dimensions beyond our limited everyday reality gradually awakens in the collective consciousness. In a broad discussion ranging from near-death and other out-of-body experiences to coma, dreams, precognition and psychedelic trips, we ask whether life and death are really what we think they are. Hello and welcome, Anthony, and thank you so much for joining us yet again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Absolutely. Always wonderful to talk to you, Greg. Always.
Yeah, it's not that long since we had a catch-up because a while went by there, a matter of years before we'd spoken, I should say, and then we got together to sort of do a retro talk about your Philip K. Dick book, the biography, and that chat was very well received. So today we're going to be going over some old ground, but some new innovations and new explorations of old territory that you're intimately familiar with, the near-death experience. And this is on the occasion of the release of your new book, Near-Death Experiences, the Science, Psychology and Anthropology Behind the Phenomenon. Now, most listeners are going to be familiar with who you are, but let's just very briefly give new listeners a potted bio.
Yeah, very quickly then. Yeah, I'm a British writer, been writing now for 2 decades, written 13 books. All my books deal with extraordinary human experiences, but my approach is always looking at it from the scientific point of view as to whether we can explain these phenomenon scientifically, and indeed, if we are explaining them scientifically, what can that tell us about the nature of reality? So, large groups of people consider me to be an arch skeptic, and other people consider me to be an arch woo-woo purveyor of nonsense. So, rather like yourself, I'm stuck on the bridge there of trying to be rational and sensible while there are two competing sides. But my approach has always been extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And I argue that by looking at these phenomena, such as near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, alien encounters, if you start looking at them in greater detail, they start to make sense in a very different way than if you just look at them from the surface. There seems to be an underlying phenomenon going on here. And it's all to do with how consciousness interacts with physical reality.
Well, while we're on that point, actually, of the extraordinary claims and extraordinary proof, the reason I've taken issue with that over the years is what the definition of extraordinary is that some, arch skeptics, people who have, attack your work, call something extraordinary, or it seems that something like the near-death experience may actually be quite a routine thing. It's just part of human experience. Yeah. So you'll understand why I pull people up and just say, hang on a minute, just be careful that we don't label, an apple falling out of a tree as an extraordinary, occurrence, as it were.
Yeah, I think what they're really talking about, aren't they, is things they cannot explain using their present scientific paradigm. And because they can't explain it via the present scientific paradigm, therefore it's impossible, therefore it's nonsense. And we don't even want to look at it or discuss it. And I find that to be incredibly unscientific, naive, and dare I say hubristic in their approach. I find it quite worrying this kind of level of dismissal. And I happily attack individuals who do that. In fact, I enjoy engaging with individuals who do that, because you suddenly find that as soon as you start digging slightly deeper, their arguments fall apart and suddenly their smugness evaporates.
Well, I've always said, if we choose to oppose the religious, we should not become too religious in our opposition. And this
Mhm.
is where the sort of militant materialism thing has come in. And, the sort of people that you're talking about were kind of like, they're using cult-like, fanatical, irrational methods to shut down people they see as cult-like or, irrational, as it were. Do you know what I mean? They're using the kind of the methods that they claim that those they wish to silence use, as it were. You know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, you were talking there about straddling, two worlds, or whatever, let's say science and spirituality, loosely, as much as some people kind of balk at the term spirituality. I think, you and I know what we mean by that. And in all your work, but in this book in particular, you do ask, especially in the first section, some quite skeptical questions about
Mhm.
near-death experiences, because not everyone claiming to have these extraordinary experiences, near death or otherwise, are having what is described. And there are certainly, people making things up and, all sorts. So they're very rigorous questions you're asking. It's that you're not just wanting people to accept this, on the word of experiencers. So you ask these skeptical questions, and you're looking at the science of all this. Can we scientifically verify this, as it were? But tacit, not even implicit, just in most cases explicit in your writing, is that because something's scientifically quote unquote impossible doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that the current scientific methods and instruments and all ways of doing things can't account for this. That's all. So I think that's what you mean by trying to sort of ride this middle ground and actually be balanced and not get pulled too far in either direction.
Totally. I mean, it's one of the things as a sociologist by my degree and training, I'm fully aware of the concept of the scientific paradigms. And also because, I also have a degree in history as well, so I'm fully aware of how science has developed over the years. And of course, science also develops not by ploughing the same route or ploughing the same furrow, but it's effectively the outlying phenomenon. It's the outlying experiences are the ones that actually bring science forward and allow science to progress. I mean, we know perfectly well that in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, there was a crisis within science because there were certain things they couldn't explain, like the retrograde motion of the outer planets. And they came up with all kinds of incredible, tortuous ways, things called epicycles and everything else, to explain how it all worked. But effectively, as soon as Copernicus came along with his heliocentric model of the solar system, suddenly everything made sense again. But of course, Copernicus was attacked, Galileo was attacked, and all these individuals, because they're focusing in on the black swans or the white crows, and they're looking at the outlying, and these are the things that make us progress. I've used many years the analogy of, in the mid 1890s, there was incredible amounts of hubristic, we know everything, like Michelson of the Michelson-Morley experiment when he was opening the Ryerson laboratory in the University of Chicago, stood up and said that there is no point in pursuing physics anymore. All we'll be doing is calculating to the sixth decimal point because we know everything. And then he said there's only one or two black clouds on the horizon, and one of them is black body radiation, and the other one is the photoelectric effect. But we'll be able to answer them soon using something that a later philosopher called promissory materialism, the idea that we don't understand these things, but we will be able to understand them in the future. But the only way they could understand both those effects was by completely the old scientific model and coming up with something completely new, which Max Planck did in December of 1900 when he stood up in Berlin and posited the idea that energy comes in little packets or quanta. And then 5 years later, in his great year, in 1905, Einstein came up and explained the photoelectric effect. But by doing so, he pointed out that in fact light was made up of tiny point particles called photons. He didn't coin the term photon, somebody else did later. But effectively, he explained it by thinking differently. And I argue that the greatest things that happen are near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and the mind-body interface and how the mind creates consciousness, how inanimate matter reacting, atoms effectively reacting in fields can create you and me and our hopes and our fears. And I think the only way we're going to progress science, because let's face it, science is in a complete mess at the moment. And I know that individuals like Brian Cox will stand up and say, oh, we know it all. Well, you don't, mate, because effectively, if you plug in the mathematical formulae that are used for the very big, that is Einsteinian relativity, and then you plug in those things and those mathematical structures to the very, very small in quantum mechanics, you get infinities. So clearly there's something wrong. We haven't gone deep enough into the levels of reality. And as long as we turn away from those big problems, such as Chalmers's hard problem of consciousness, we're not going to get anywhere. We have to just face up to the fact that we have no idea how the brain creates consciousness and self-referential consciousness. And those self-referential consciousnesses are the things that experience out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and all the other anomalous experiences that interest you and I.
Well, I think in lots of people who opine in public about matters that affect society and culture and just the whole human experiment have often very different things to say when they're not in public, basically. So you mentioned science there, the sort of capital S science, the people, the Brian Coxes of this world and the other people that we hear about, people who write books, make TV programs, people who teach the science in big institutions and what have you, a certain version of things. But history's replete with, and you'll be aware of, and maybe even spoken with, all sorts of people, scientists included, who said, "Oh, James, you know what? Actually, this, and this, I'm not sure about, and I don't think this is right. And do you know that actually loads of us have tested this experimentally, but we weren't able to publish, or they just don't talk about it, or the public aren't aware of X, Y, and Z. So there's so much going on."
Well, of course, the public aren't. I mean, there's research going on now that is mind-blowing in terms of DMT and how DMT alters consciousness. And they've discovered that unlike the general belief that entheogens or hallucinogenic substances actually make the brain more active, they're discovering quite the opposite. I think there's research being done at the University of Sussex now with psilocybin, where they've discovered it actually switches the brain off. It actually stops the brain's ability to effectively allow us the perception of a broader perceptual reality. And this has long been argued from Henri Bergson onwards through to C.D. Broad and various other people, Aldous Huxley. They all argue that the brain was an attenuator, that it takes information out in order for allow us to function effectively within whatever this external reality that we interface with via our senses is. And they quite laterally believe that, of course, the brain, when you have hallucinations, bits of the brain link up in certain ways to create the hallucinations, in raised commas. And of course, nobody knows what an hallucination is. So again, that's hubris. But effectively, what they've discovered is quite the opposite. Is that just like C.D. Broad and Aldous Huxley argued all those years ago, this is exactly what the brain. You take entheogens, it switches the brain off. So in other words, the argument from that, and there's only one logical conclusion that can be made from that, is that the brain denies us access. Ordinary functioning brain, a neurotypical brain, denies us access to this greater reality, this greater informational field that sits out there.
Well, turning in more detail then to the near-death experience itself, I've said a word about that in my recorded introduction, but most people should be, loosely familiar, at least with what that is, because the near-death experience is certainly out there a great deal, isn't it? Being talked and written about and making its way into popular fiction and whatnot. But it appears this has been happening in all of human history, as far as we can tell. There's different accounts of it, and you do go into this in your book, the anthropology of the experience. But in the modern era, one of the most interesting developments in medicine has been that resuscitation technology. The ability to bring people back, as it were, medically from actual bodily death. Like, oh, this person is dead. Oh no, wait, we brought them back. Can be a thing that couldn't really be done, as far as we can tell, in millennia gone by. And also the keeping of people alive when they would otherwise die, or hovering at a certain, almost like a limbo state that otherwise would have just terminated in death. And also the coma states. And I know that I recently did a show about coma states and the experiences that people in comas were having, and I recommended that to you. Well, I didn't. You might already have looked at that book, but the point was that putting people in coma is a modern. People, of course, slip into a coma for all sorts of reasons, but placing people, medically induced comas is a modern development. So all of what I'm talking about in the medical realm here has widened the field of experience, I think, in terms of the number of reportees, as it were. And a lot of them, because they're in a hospital setting when this is happening, they're talking to medical professionals about it. And so that's one of the most interesting developments in the 20th and 21st centuries, I think.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, this is the issue that, as you know, in the book, I have an extensive discussion on what is life and what is death, and indeed what is mind. And I go into great detail about the latest research as to what these terms are and what they mean. And the borderlands between life and death have become so broad now because of as you say, because of resuscitation techniques, and because the way in which we can now, using things like, sort of certain scanning devices, we're in the position brain activity in somebody who's dying. And much to their surprise, over recent years, they've made some astonishing discoveries about what is taking place in the brain at the point of death. Now, this is one of the reasons I've written this book, because there are so many books out there, and they're very, very good and very interesting, but they're a series of phenomenological, it happened to me, or it happened to this person. So in other words, it's only taking it from the viewpoint of the experiencer as to what takes place in a near-death experience. And of course that is valid, but it's not ever going to convince anybody who is a skeptic about what is really taking place in a near-death experience. So I've taken it upon myself to turn it on its head and to say, well, let's just look at what actually takes place in the brain. Yes, of course, I cite numerous classic cases, and a number of those cases are interesting. Some of them fall apart ever so slightly when you start looking at them in greater detail. But when you look at the neurological aspects and the neurochemical aspects, they're finding some extraordinary things. I mean, one of the things I was astonished to discover, that, way back in 2009, there was a Washington-based anesthesiologist called Dr. Lakmia Chawla, who published a paper that year where they were doing a study of end-of-life neurological activity. And they reported on 7 critically ill patients who had their life support removed. So they were in the circumstances where they had somebody who was critically ill and there was no real chance of survival. So they removed the life support at the agreement, obviously, of the families. But they then had the opportunity then to monitor the brain activity of those patients as they were dying. And they used something called, without being technical, something called an SED line root device, which can monitor brain activity. And they noted a large number of the cases of the patients at the point of death and immediately after, there was a huge surge of gamma wave activity within the brain. So this gamma ray activity is when the brain is very, very active. And this was astonishing to them. The idea that suddenly when the brain is dying, instead of switching everything off, it does the opposite. It comes to life. And not only does it come to life, but it comes to life again in a similar way to the thing I was talking about, the people that were being monitored at the University of of Sussex, whereby it fires up in different parts of the brain, and these start communicating with each other. Now, this is extraordinary, and not only these, but they're called BIS spikes. And with 7 patients, they lasted between 30 to 180 seconds after death. Now, this in itself was astonishing. And this stimulated other people to start looking into this. And it was found, for instance, that there was somebody called Gambra in 2005 who again noticed a massive spike in brain activity of a 79-year-old woman who was beginning the dying process. And although this was not post-mortem, it's again evidence that the activity of the brain starts before brain death and continues afterwards. And this intrigued other researchers, including the fascinating lady called Jimo Borjigin, who is a neurologist who works at the University of Michigan. And in 2013, she was doing work on rats. And what they were doing, they anesthetized rats, a group of rats, and then they put the rats in a state of cardiac arrest. So they anesthetized the rats, then they put them into anesthetization. And again, they observed a massive increase in gamma wave activity within the dying rat's brain. And again, they discovered this idea of coherence in the brain, the idea that all the kind of the waves, the brain waves, all start to cohere, they all start to resonate together in the same way. And this resonance, again, it was gamma ray oscillations, which is between 35 to 55 hertz. And this continued for more than 15 seconds after the rats were clinically dead. There should have been no brain activity going on, but for 15 seconds, the brain continued firing. Now, how can brain activity happen in something that is dead? And people do not know about this. And there's a term now, they're actually called the acronym ELES, which is end of life EEG surges. And they know about these, they've been studying them 15 years or more. And again, the perfect thing happened, and it was quite tragic. But the perfect thing happened in 2022, I should say. So it was just as I was coming to the end of the book when the most astonishing thing happened. And this should have been literally headlines round the world. What happened was there was a Canadian guy who was living in Germany. And he was 87 years old, and he fell off a ladder, and he quite damaged himself. But he was brought into the hospital, and he was given a series of tests. And from coma things, the Glasgow coma scale, which is the way in which they measure levels of coma. So he was fairly active. 15 is a very minor situation to be in, but he rapidly deteriorated while he was in a CT scan. So they were scanning his brain when he started to die. Now, this was extraordinary because this is the first time a human being was being measured in a CT scan as they died. And what did they discover? Exactly the same as Jimo Borjigin had discovered and various other things. He went into a state called status epilepticus, which is effectively a series of powerful, continual, one after the other, epileptic seizures. The whole brain was firing crazily. And he died. And the signals continued after he had died. Now, in comparison to this, there's also an Italian researcher called Pani, and he was working with primates. And again, he was measuring the after-death activity with primates. He found the after-death activity in the brain could go on for hours. So the question here you have to ask yourself is what is taking place here. Now, you may recall, there's no reason why you're that au fait with my work, but in my very first book, Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, which I wrote in the late 1990s and was eventually published in 2006, I had a whole section on how intrigued I was that when babies are born, they are born having an with slow delta waves and high gamma waves in the brain. And also, they're born in a seizure state. They're born in a state of almost like a get status epilepticus. And the convulsion spikes become more and more frequent as the baby gets closer to birth. These epileptic seizures get greater and greater and greater. So we die in an epileptic seizure, and we are born in an epileptic seizure. And this is the first interview, Greg, by the way, I've ever discussed this. But isn't this intriguing? Could there be a linkage? Could this be proof of my cheating the ferryman hypothesis? That when you die, you're literally reborn again as yourself. You go back and you're reborn. So here we have these two epileptic seizures taking place at the point of death and the point of life. And in my book, I quote, there's a guy called Émile Goncourt, who was a French writer who experienced severe temporal lobe epilepsy. And he came across, it was the most extraordinary quotation where he explained life. And he said life was a nothing between two epileptic seizures. And this is exactly what I propose. Because, of course, you know that I'm fascinated by altered states of consciousness that are brought about when people have epileptic seizures. And I have many, many people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy. And I believe that's what a near-death experience is. It's a DMT, endogenous DMT facilitated temporal lobe seizure. And within who, if there are people listening to here who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE, you will know what I'm talking about here. It is they feel that they're dying sometimes. They feel time is slowing down. They have fantastic deja vu sensations. They have all the sensations that are associated with the near-death experience. And I believe there's a direct link here. So suddenly, for the first time, we're in this position where, and I genuinely believe I'm the only writer on the planet pulling this together. And it sometimes frustrates the hell out of me. Sometimes it doesn't. People want to read my stuff. They do. And if they don't, they don't. But I really genuinely want serious scientific researchers to read my work and say, oh, Tony, it's nonsense. You're wrong. But whenever I get contacted by neurologists or people studying DMT or studying the temporal lobe epilepsy and neurology, when people do read my work, they come back to me telling me how astonished they are as to how I've made all these links. Because nobody has come back to me and said I'm wrong. Only people ever come back to me and they're astonished that me as a layperson has pulled this all together, whereas they've missed it. And this is why I think that my work is ignored. Because my work is an embarrassment. My work is an embarrassment because they can't dismiss me as a new age woo-woo writer. Because they can't. I genuinely do the science, and I'm genuinely saying to people, if I'm wrong, tell me. But this stuff is really, really interesting, and I think so important. And if anybody wants to know more about the particular cases I'm talking about, the Pierpaolo Pani case was in 2018, and it involved a macaque monkey, and it was 2 hours that the brain continued effectively doing things. And the 2022 German case is somebody called Vicenti. And again, if you read my book, I give you the complete references to this. So what is this telling us? Well, I believe what they're measuring in this brain activity is the near-death experience.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalisefreedom.com.
Legalisefreedom.com